I'm ready.
Okay.
Anin, Nimkis Dishnakas, Makadeva Ingandodum Hodawa, Anishnabek. I said, hello, my name is Thunder, and I'm from the Odawa people, who is part of the three tribes that comprise the Council of Three Fires. That's the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi tribes. These three tribes had their origins on the East Coast, aligned with the Abenaki Alliance, which are five tribes: Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Micmac, Maliseet, and Aroostook. And they also affiliate with other tribes in that region, all the way to the Maritimes. Anthropologists figure that we moved over here probably around 1100, 1200. And the theory that I like to follow, rather than what is commonly accepted as a theory of the Bering Strait, well, certainly some of the people came across the Bering Strait. Another group of people moved up from South America, followed the coastline, and they went as far north as about where corn would not grow anymore. And after several centuries living there, they moved to the west. And even though we aren't the largest Indian populations throughout the country, we have the largest language territory. Our language is spoken all the way from the Maritimes all the way out to Alberta, Canada, where they have Ojibwe Cree language spoken. And we have, I think we're in 9 states of the United States and 5 provinces of Canada. So you can see that we have an extensive area where our language is spoken, and that's mainly because of trade. The Ojibways, the Odawas, and the Potawatomis were noted farmers and traders, as well as warriors. So we moved into the Michigan area, and how we measure time, or how time has been measured, is how many times did we stop after we left the East Coast area. And they say 7 times, and that number is significant within our people. And so one of the places they set up here in Michigan was up in Grand Island in Lake Superior. And this is what we call the Grand Medicine Lodge. This is part of our religion. They tell us that we are the Council of Three Fires, and everyone automatically, and to a certain extent, it's true, because we're 7 brothers. But it's 3 brothers, excuse me. I keep thinking that 7. Our 3 tribes. But what it really means is we have 3 fires that are very similar all the way through, but are different in some ways. And that's our Medicine Lodge and the Morning Lodge, Wabano, and we have the Shaking Tent people. So we have 3 different major ways of worship, but they all are part of the same intrinsic value of our religion. I mentioned 7. When we pray, give thanks, or to pray for help, we pray in 7 directions. The first is, of course, the universe, which is all-encompassing, where we know the great power comes from that creates all life on Earth. The sun, the moon, the planets, the gravitational pull of those planets as they swing around through their orbits and line up, that kind of thing. And of course our Mother Earth, we pray that direction. And then we pray to the 4 directions. In each of those directions, there's a plant, there's a tree, there's an animal, different things that are aspects of our total life. And so we pray to the east, the south, west, north, and then the 7th direction is to all our relation. And what that means is we start out as who we are as a human. We have our ancestors, we have our community, we have our family, and ourselves. And then we have our clans. The clan tells us who we are and what our function in life is. I happen to be of the Black Wolf clan, and Black Wolf clan members tend to be teachers, politicians, community activists, that type of thing. So you're involved at that level in your community. Then you have your individual name. Mine was given to me by my grandfather, and my name is Nimke. The first, at first blush, is simply the name Thunder. But then you take it another step and you say, the noise of the wings of the thunderbird when it flaps its wings. And then that thunderbird brings light. We talk about lightning, but there's other kinds of light. So you're a bringer of light. And that's a responsibility then that you take up partly as a teacher. That what you learn, you're required to share. Because the first law of survival is sharing. So you begin to understand then when we speak of all our relations, my next step is I was born in March when the maple tree, or Umtuksizabak, which gives its life's blood that we make into maple syrup. So that's a personal dotem to me, is that maple tree. So when I have dance clothes, I have a maple leaf here and there to signify what I'm about too, what I think of. And then we have the other different plants and animals that we use for medication and for food. At one time for clothing, and now we use it in our dance clothes. And so we have, when we speak of all our relations, we're talking not just of blood relatives or clan or tribe. We're talking about all the living things that we know of in the universe, because we're related to them. Without them, we would not exist. We understand that as human beings, we're one of the weakest links in this whole process. And so we give thanks to all of those living beings, plant, animal, fish, or bird, that provide us with sustenance, provide us protection, provide us with the ingredients of life. And so we look at that 7 directions when we pray. But we also know that as we came north and went up way north and then came west, we brought things with us. One of the things that we have always had is corn. We are basically a corn culture. And the corn is probably one of the most widely used food products in the world today. Even popcorn we had. So we lived quite comfortably. Certainly everybody, because of the weather, had hard times. It doesn't matter what color you were, race, color, or creed, wintertime was harsh. And so we lived in communal villages throughout most of the good weather. And then when the winter came, we moved out into the places we call the winter camps. One of the areas that you can see is north of Petoskey and up towards Alance, and in between there you can see some small lakes and swamps and protected from the great winds from the lake. So we went to different areas, split up, and then we come back together. So when the Indians moved into this area, we settled in Georgian Bay, around Georgian Bay, and Manitoulin Island for a number of years, and then migrated further west and south. When you look at the history of this region, you'll see Mackinac Island. And if you're looking at Mackinac Island, look at it from the north to the south, because that's where the wilderness was. Everything else was civilized along that lake. As you know, Mackinac Island was a very large, for the time, very large metro center, so to speak, because all the trade goods, the traders, the trappers, the furs, all the goods were brought into that Straits area around Sheboygan, Mackinac Island, St. Ignace, Sault Ste. Marie. It was a large, large population. South of the bridge, there was a place we called Waganuxie, the land of the crooked tree. And John Audubon and a few other folks talk about the large population of that region. And they said you could walk 26 miles and not be out of sight of an Indian lodge. And so it started up at Cross Village, down to Middle Village, down to what is called Harbor Springs, Badasagay, and a little bit further east toward Charlevoix. And at Charlevoix, at the Pine River, there was a large village that was there. And just about any river, lake, or outlet, you will find evidence of Indian people living at that place at one point or another. And so this region that we're in, the Grand Traverse region, its history is interesting because just like anywhere else, you go and you trap and you hunt. And I know of people who came north to go deer hunting and ended up living here. People who traveled different places for trade, liked it, and stayed. And so this whole region was a lot of native people. Up in the peninsula is what's interesting, because if you look right on both sides of the peninsula, draw some lines, you'll find that the tip of the old Mission Peninsula was a travel trade route. Skipped over from what is now Elk Rapids over toward the old Mission Peninsula, Portage, if you wanted to carry things around, or you just went around the tip of it. But then you went straight west and you end up over in what is was called Eagletown, Pashabitown, Omina, and Waukeesville, which morphed into being the village of Northport. But we always, those three tribes, remember I mentioned the three tribes, and we all have the basic same language. We have three different ways of worship, and we also integrated through marriage. And so, like myself, I'm one quarter Ojibwe, I'm Odawa, and a little bit of French. So you can see that even when the traders came, there was no distinctions. The only distinction we had with race and racial problems were with the English. The English, in my opinion, are known for their racism no matter where they go. And so we had a great deal of racial problems with the English. Somebody said to me one time about immigrants. Immigrants are odd. And I said, well, what do you mean? Well, look at the natives of Mexico. They come up to California. I said, well, they've always lived there. Yeah, but some come up and they tend to stay by themselves, and they tend to speak their own language, and they don't get out in the community, and they have their own little ways of worship, and they don't trust anybody who isn't like them. I said, well, as a native person over here in the Great Lakes, we had the same trouble too. They called themselves English. And they wouldn't respect our traditions. They wouldn't respect the gift giving. They really denigrated our religion. And when you do the research, you'll find that the English had 500 years of anti-tribalism before they got here, and it just carried over up through time and passed it on to their offspring, the Americans. So we've got a lot of issues and problems that were created way back in time elsewhere that we have to deal with, and we as natives have always had to deal with that kind of issue. The French, they were more different. They accepted what we had and understood it and gave us a leeway. And same way with the Finlanders. The Finnish people came. You go different parts of the northern, over the 45th parallel out of Wisconsin, Minnesota, North Dakota, where we've integrated, and lovingly and jokingly we call people of that descendancy Findians. And so we have always been pretty much open and acceptable to other peoples. And so this area here in this region got known for that early on. We didn't have the major wars that took place on the East Coast and later on out in the Midwest, because we were involved in trade. We were, if you use modern terms today, we were resource developers, we were resource consultants, provided the labor, provided the direction, the selection of furs, and so we were involved in international trade. Over at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, they have what they called trade goods or artifacts that were traded for different things here in the Great Lakes, beadwork, clothing, all types of things. Because if you recall, the people of the Netherlands were the ones that created the banking world trade system. And so they financed a lot of the trade companies that came here. And so to pay them back, they paid them back, of course, in tobacco and furs and later on copper. But a lot of it was the clothing and different jewelry artifacts of the native people in the Great Lakes region. So when they came in, they settled, the Indian people that were up around Mackinac and Waganukse, they moved out little by little. As the population grew and the resources diminished, they had to move. And so many of them came down into the Grand Traverse Bay, the old Mission Peninsula, when people began to look in the 1830s. That was a great movement. What took place prior to the Treaty of 1836 and some of the things that happened just prior to that, you have to remember the fur trade was beginning to diminish somewhat. And so different stores were opened up, not specifically for fur trade, but to provide food for the settlers. So 1821, the American Fur Company, John Jacob Astor, had an agent, Mr. Stewart, and then Rix Robinson. They went down to the Grand River, what is now near Ada, and opened a store there. And the reason they did was John Jacob Astor, the American Fur Company, was starting to acquire smaller companies. And they wanted a franchise that would protect them from Hudson's Bay, the other companies that were in the Northwest Traders. A lot of small companies they began to buy up. So in that process of trying to get that massive fur franchise, he decided, along with the Catholic Church, that they could get most of the Lower Peninsula and part of the Upper Peninsula. So they began negotiating. The other reason they were interested is, remember, the Erie Canals, the canal system had developed, Erie Canal had been opened, and so there was an influx of settlers into Michigan after 1825. There was just instant adults, boatloads, wagon loads, people on foot, trying to come to Michigan, the new frontier. And so they needed the land. And of course, at the time, the U.S. was financially strapped, and so they were looking for land to sell, to acquire land. So with that in mind, the Catholic Church and John Jacob Astor, petitioned Congress, and they wanted this franchise, which later became the outlines in the Treaty of 1836. Well, there were two brothers, the Blackbird brothers from Petoskey, Harbor Springs, Andrew and William. They'd gone to Oberlin College, they'd studied, they were accomplished linguists, spoke several languages, including Latin. But they resisted the treaty efforts. They were trying to organize the people. So the Catholic Church asked them if one of them would like to be a priest to all the Catholics, and that would kind of pave the way to get this treaty passed. So they finally got the treaty passed, but in 1833, because William Blackbird was resistant to the treaty and been writing Congress and anybody who could, church groups to write to resist the treaty, and had created a groundswell, he was found assassinated in his room in the Vatican on June 25th, 1833. When the news got back to Michigan that he'd been murdered, several of our people fled and went to Manitoulin Island in Canada and have remained there ever since. Some were my blood kin, but they didn't want to stay. And of course, that August and later that fall, there was a massive meteor shower. And that really made people think. So another group from Muskegon area, they went up to Manitoulin. And so we have people who had lived here but now are residents of Canada. So as we were settling this and all this was taking place, 1830s, they found Indians up on the old Mission Peninsula, had lived there for hundreds of years. And the original peninsula was to be a reservation. And land had been reserved for the Indian people there. The Leelanau Peninsula, all the way to south of Sutton's Bay, was set aside as an Indian reservation. But as you know, through time, it got down to about 12 pitiful acres, and Amelia Schaub, an attorney in Leelanau County, went to their defense and saved the land till they could become federal recognized, and the rest is history. But when they looked at that peninsula and realized the value of it as farmland and cherry orchards, and certainly now in modern times the grapes that are there and the wines that are produced. So they decided that they wanted to get some property set aside for the Indian people, and Reverend Doherty and Reverend Smith and other folks that came a little later began to set aside pieces of property to make sure that the Indian people would have a place to live. Agosa and some of the others went further west and ended up over by Omina. And if you go a little west and north of Omina, there was a place called Agosa Town, where there was a village. Now these leaders, we call them in our language as Ogama, or those who lead. And to become an Ogama, there were two ways to do it. The first was you earned it. Now, I have relatives, I've got, they're good hunters, all of them. But there's a couple that are really good hunters, really good shots. So if I were to choose someone to follow during the hunting time, I would make those cousins my Ogama. You're my leader. You tell me what to do, how to do it. The other way was once you became a leader in an Ogama, you stayed there until you were proven that you couldn't do it anymore. And then it might pass to your son. The son might inherit that leadership role, but still it has to be earned. If he can't fulfill it, then he's bypassed and someone else is the Ogama. So we had leaders for different things, whether maybe it was farming, maybe the women that really knew the farming would teach young people. It was funny because once the War Department was established for sway over Indians, and then through time it became Department of Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, etc. They wanted to teach us to be farmers. And when the European got here, we were practicing planting by phases of the moon, crop rotation, contour farming, hybrid farming of plants, of corn, different plants. We were farmers. We were fishermen. We were hunters. We had to balance meals that allowed us to remain healthy. So during the 1830s, there was a great deal of movement was taking place, again, because Andrew Jackson had decided that he wanted a coin of the realm, or hard money, not paper money. He fought the banks over the gold standard, and of course there had been wars that had taken place beginning way back, major wars, 1863 forward in this region, with the British and the Americans and the French, even the Spanish. So this country was broke. And so Jackson decided, I know how we can get rich again or have money. Let's kill or remove all the Indians east of the Mississippi. We'll take over their land and we'll package it up and sell it. And so that was their process. So in 1830, they began the great experiment called the Indian Removal Act. And they began to remove Indians from here to the west. We have Odawas in Oklahoma, Potawatomis in Oklahoma and Kansas, Ojibways out in some other states, in Iowa, Tama, Iowa, there's Potawatomis. We always hear about the Trail of Tears with the Cherokees, but that came 6 years after removal began here. They just had the most publicity. But it had been practiced for 6 years in the removal here in this region. So the tide turned. Rather than assimilation and integration and getting along, it began to be ripped apart because of land. Settlers came in, the Dutch settlers of Holland, Michigan, went and raided these Indian farms, went in and stole their food, and went in and killed Indians to the point, and one time they came in and stole and killed Indians on a Sunday, their holy day, and tried to convince us to become Christians so we could be like them, and when we died we could go to heaven. And our answer has always been, don't you think meeting you once was enough? We don't want to do that. So that's why you have A lot of our people today, there's 1,200 Indians in Michigan who are not federal recognized, and we have probably over half of the population, maybe 2/3, who are non-Christian, who follow our old ways. We don't discriminate against anyone as we're discriminated against for being non-Christians, and we just think of all of our relations and how we must have to live together. So that's kind of a guiding force with our people. Some people say we're stoic or we're quiet, or they'll just sit and not say anything. Well, that's because we're not going to offend anybody. We're not going to try to make them think our way either. So those are some things that cause this area to become like it has with this population. Rather than have confrontations, open confrontations, a lot of Indians just walk away and go to the most convenient place. Now, what happened there down around the Black River and Black Lake with the Hollanders that came, there was a Reverend Smith, George and Arvella Smith. They had saw what Peter Doherty had done in the mission in Omina. So they began to look for properties. The Treaty of 1836 was signed. We'd ceded the land from Grand Rapids to Alpena to almost to Marquette. We were to be paid with teachers, schools, buildings, animal husbandry, carpentry. We put all those education provisions in that treaty, plus along with some annuity payments. Well, it never happened. They got the land and we got nothing. So with that, it opened the minds of the settlers that we can mistreat Indians any way we want. 1838, there was a mother and children murdered along the Grand River. And the Indians got the blame for it, and we almost had an Indian war in 1838 because of that. 1841, they found the husband alive in Wisconsin. So they realized the Indians hadn't committed the murder, it was the husband. But Henry Schoolcraft and all those so-called liberals back then blamed the Indians for that. So it got to be hard to be an Indian to own farmland. So Reverend Smith moved with the leader of Waukezu and created a town in Linlaw County called Waukezuville. All the streets were named Indian names, and eventually developers came, took it over, and it became Northport. But Reverend Smith and Arvella, the Indians that they moved up here, one of them was a young man named Payson Wolf. And Payson Wolf eventually married Arvella and George's daughter. They were sent to the Benzonia Academy in Benzonia, Michigan, but they were given the parentage was George and Arvella Smith, because the Indian at that time wasn't allowed a lot of different places in the state. So we are very proud of that fact because we know it was the first integrated school in Michigan, because those kids were half Indian. Payson Wolf was full Indian. He ended up in the Civil War, was wounded, and is currently buried in Cross Village, Michigan. So in the 1830s, we had a lot of change going on, a lot of property being lost by Indians. The Homestead Act had been passed in '62, so that opened up this whole region for settlement. So we lost more land then. But the threat of removal always hung over everyone's head, and that's why Peter Doherty and the Smiths, other groups, protected the Indian people. Those who were members of their congregations received their protection. So that changed a lot of land use and land ownership. And then the Civil War came, and the Indians were told that if they joined the military, they could become citizens, even though the state in the first state of Michigan, this first Constitution of 1851 had given Indian citizenship, but subsequent revisions of the Constitution removed them from being citizens. So basically, modern times, Indians, my dad was born right here on this property, and I was born here too. My dad was born here in Benzie County, Platte Township, was not a citizen of the United States when he was born. But he fought World War II and always paid his taxes and did whatever, but when he was born, he wasn't a citizen, so I jokingly refer to myself as a son of a POW because we were basically POWs until we got citizenship. When that pen lifted off the paper, we lost 100 million acres. We didn't have enough Indians to go around to hold the land that we had, and we lost that. So basically all the negotiations that we have had in this region with the United States government have been land grabs. And the last I was paid for the land that was taken in 1836, 3 years ago now I was finally paid. And my share was $12,866.63 for all the land north of Grand Rapids all the way to Marquette. So this property that I sit on, my great-grandfather and grandfather and great-uncle bought it because they had a logging business. So you'll find that after the 1830s and after the Civil War, we sent out the Michigan Sharpshooters, Company K, 1st Michigan, and we came back. We didn't get the 160 acres in the mule as promised. We didn't get our citizenship, and we didn't get our money. So we were used once again. But you'll find that per capita, when this country is in need of soldiers or warriors, per capita we have the greatest contribution of any ethnic group in this country. And we hear of the World War II, of the language that was spoken, Dene or Navajo language, code talkers. They don't tell you there were 18 different tribes involved in that program. Some right here from Michigan. The Anishnaebek was spoken in Europe and Italy and North Africa by our men on the radios. But that was kept a big secret. And finally it came out after so many years, and they find out that the Native contribution, beginning with the Revolutionary War, has been heavy all the way through all of the wars. And I bring this up because whenever you go to a Native gathering, particularly the Jingdamuk, or what they call the powwow, or a social gathering, we honor the veterans. That is done religiously. We honor the veterans all the time. We just wish this country, America, would honor the veterans like the natives do, because I think after a fashion, it gets to be a sad and a difficult duty to talk about this. My father, World War II, was in the Philippines. Came home in uniform and couldn't get a room, couldn't get service in a restaurant and in a bar. And so people wonder why Indians tend to be reserved. We just don't like being whipped all the time. Traverse City, we look at it as just another way to spell Tupelo, Mississippi, 50 years ago. To live around this northern Michigan as a native is difficult at best. And the discrimination, it's gone underground. I think the influx of people from other areas, and they've lived, in different neighborhoods with different ethnic groups and people. So that has helped considerably. But there's old families, old timers, they just don't forget. And we've had a difficult time holding on our properties. We had a difficult time all during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. In this state, there were 33 civil rights violations filed. Only 3 were acted upon. It was finally proven to the U.S. civil rights that the DNR had orchestrated a 15-year campaign, what we called economic terrorism. They went to every lakeside community, and this was proven by their travel logs, and they told the people, if you don't stop Indian gill netting, your restaurants, motels, bait shops, stores are all going to close because the Indians are taking all of your fish. They didn't tell that the DNR had violated the aquaculture law of 1928, which says you shall not plant any exotic species of fish for commercial or sport fishing in Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes. Great Lakes, excuse me. I know that for a fact because I worked on the revision of that law in years afterward. So the DNR violated their own laws by bringing in the coho, which eats its weight every day when it's an adult. We have lost all of our fish that we used to have. We don't have brook trout anymore because the coho ruined the spawning beds. We don't have smelt anymore, or perch, or walleye, because they eat their weight every day. And so the federal government comes in and dumps lake trout in, supposedly to restock the Great Lakes, but all they're doing is they put in feed program for the coho. And when those lake trout don't mature as they're supposed to, then the Indians get the blame. We've often wondered how they're going to blame us for Syria and Egypt, because everything, ecology that happens here, we get the blame. And they don't think about the orchards. They don't think about all of the runoff of the golf courses. They didn't think about the processing plant, electrical generating plant in Ludington, which chewed up more fish in one day than Indians caught in a week. And so the history of this area goes on. It's not over. It's continuous. Sometimes it's in flux. Sometimes it looks pretty good. But the native people have decided that over time that we need to participate. And so we eventually, the Indian tribes got the right for bingo halls and casinos, which has been an economic boon to this area. Traverse City is one of the more stable economic areas in the state and the country. And the casinos have contributed a lot. At one time, the casinos, before the Governor Engler broke the contracts, went back on his word, they had put over $200 million into the Michigan Strategic Fund, which the governor used as his personal slush fund. They don't realize how much we have contributed, not only just money, but all this property that was given free, ended up free to everybody. Our food, all the food that we have contributed. School children often ask, what is an Indian meal like? How do you have an Indian meal? And I just tell them, go to your cupboard, open your cupboard, and if you've got corn, potatoes, some fish, local fish, venison, blackberries, blueberries, turkey, that's an Indian meal. That's what we lived on. And we were like, modern people now are beginning to understand good eating habits. And we always believed you ate seasonally, and whatever was in growing at the time, you ate a lot of it. You preserved some, but you ate a lot of whatever was growing. And so we ate a lot of greens and a lot of fish, fruits. And in the fall come, we smoke the fish, smoke the venison. Corn, you take sweet corn and you can roast it. You even get it dark, burn it, so to speak. Let it dry and you scrape that off, and then you cook that up with the meat and things that you save. The other way we take corn is we use hardwood. Now, one of our rules, I mentioned earlier, our religious beliefs, we have 21 rules we live by. What I find interesting is 10 of those rules match the 10 commandments of Christianity. 10 of those rules match 10 rules of another religion. And the 21 rules we find in some other religion who have as many rules as we do. So one of those rules is, the last rule is always be brave and never fear any death. So as a young man, I thought about that. The bravery part I could get. The death part, well, what does it mean? Any death. How many are there? And so I finally came up with a idea of that. And it's like a maple tree. Number one, a maple grove is like a family. And the young ones here, then the elders that protect them. Well, when a tree falls over or is cut down, it's died. That tree died. So people come along and they cut that tree up into wood chunks and use it to heat their home. Well, that tree caught on fire and there's another death. But now it's just ashes. So we know it's dead, or we think. But what we do is we take that ashes out and we clean it till it's like a powder. Then we take that Indian corn that you see hanging on doors, that color corn. It can be 10 years old, it can be 100 years old. We mix that corn with those ashes and we cook it. And as it cooks and the chemicals come out of those ashes, leaches into the corn, it takes that husk right off the corn. And we end up with hominy. And then we wash all the ashes off. Over here we've got a kettle of meat cooking, whatever you want to mix. And we clean that corn up real good, and then we dump it in that kettle of meat, and we have corn soup. We call it damnabu. And when the women or anyone makes that soup, they sing this song about making this corn. I'm making this corn from ashes to feed us. And so you see that tree that fell, it died, it got burned up, it died, there were ashes that died, but we mix it with that dead corn and we have something that gives you life and sustenance. And so we think about those things when we do it. And there's certain weather we make that corn in, there's certain weather we don't make that corn in because of how it reacts and the prayers and the stories that go with it. So every plant, every animal has a prayer, it has a song, and it has a story. And so that's when we pray, we talk about all our relations, because all of that's in us. And so we try to keep this alive, even in today's modern society and the pressures we have. I told you the politics, the government, the different things that has happened to us. We've still come out of that a very strong and whole people in the process. And in some cases, it's given us more strength, I think, than we might not have had. And it has given us another way to look at things. In our way of thinking, the circle is sacred. The earth, Mother Earth, Grandmother Moon, Father Sun, they're in circles. And so when we think of a circle, if you put something in a circle, and you wanted to go around that circle and look at that one item in that circle, you have to remember there are 360 different ways to look at that one item if it's in a circle. And so you have to look at it. Then you could even take it further and say, well, this circle's this way. Let's put a circle this way. 360. So you've got 4 lines, 4 sections, and 360 and 360 to look at that. Well, these keep adding those circles. Pretty soon you end up with a perfect orb. So 360 goes into that perfect orb. How many times? And so you can see how many different ways there are to understand, experience, and see one item. And so we think of that in our process. All of the way that we believe ties to the earth. There was an Egyptian one time who was a leader, and it got misinterpreted. Everybody said he said that God was the sun. And what he said was, if you want to see the omnipotent power of the creation, all you have to do is look at that sun. Because without that sun, there would be no life. Without that sun, we would have nothing. And that's what he believed. We also believe of a great power, of a great mystery. We don't say God or anything like that, but I think we're communicating along the same lines. But our way, people don't understand that if this God created the heavens and the universe and all things, then that power of God or that power of energy is in everything. Everything has that energy. And that's why we must accept everything as a living being. Other philosophies say, oh no, God only made humans and we dominate the earth and the animals don't have rights either. But we see a lot of human beings now saying animals have rights. And the pollutions that we have. There is such a thing as light pollution and sight pollution and sound pollution. And so if we can sit long enough and try to listen to our relation on a daily basis, I think it changes you. I can go outside and I can hear that wind going through the trees without leaves. This summer I'll hear it with leaves, different sound. I can look at a tree and know what its gift is to the rest of us. I don't care what kind of tree it is, they all give gifts. And so as we go through life, we live in a modern world. We have a lot of modern things that we do. But if we remember our ancestors, remember our community, our family, and ourselves, if we bring honor to them, we will bring honor to all our relations. And in that process, you begin to depend psychologically, physically on the earth itself. And if we can do this without destruction, in our ignorance we do these things. But when we get our knowledge and acquire more knowledge, then we must cease to practice some of the things that we do, the destructive things. I know we all drive cars. We all use electricity, most of us. Even if we want to get off the grid, we still use chemical and process to make those grids that will absorb the sun. So we have to be careful on how we live, what we choose. And I think we have to be open with each other in the process of understanding our common histories. Because I know of people who have lived in this area much longer than my family. My family moved out of the Lowell area in 1839 up to the Oceana County in 1840s, and then in 1898 moved to Benzie County. My grandmother's people moved up to Leelanau County in 1849 from, as we say, down below. And so we have to keep that history alive. We have to understand each other's history, understand each other's values. And I've found in doing that kind of research, the more I look for differences, the less differences I found. To the point where you even wonder how people evolve and how people come together and expand. Look at the European, when they came here, we got the metal and kettles and all those trade goods, but by the same token, they learned to survive in the wilderness and got clothing and understood more about this part of the world. And so as we go through it, we just remember our history and keep it alive and don't try to hide it. That's why I think it's great that the Old Mission Peninsula Historical Society is going back and looking at the history of that strip of land that runs out into the water and all the various cultures that have lived there and the various people and the different kind of things that have happened. I met Indian people from over in Burt Lake, and they knew Traverse City in the Old Mission Peninsula because that's where they came to pick cherries. The family did every year. And so we had families of people that worked on these farms for generations. Some even lived there, worked there all year round. And so we used to go for rides years ago. I'd mentioned that. We'd look at cherry orchards and see how they were trimmed up and what family did it, whether it was the Andersons or Wilsons or the John family, those kinds of things. So the history of this particular region has barely been scratched. We have Helen Untanner, who has written a couple books on the region. And at the Benzie Historical Museum, there's a booklet that really explains the Old Mission Peninsula and the development of it and the history of it. So the preservation of that history, I think, is something that will be greatly appreciated for generations to come. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some of this history with you. In our language, you say Chimagach, which is many thanks, and Bama Pi Kwabman. We will see each other again.